Welcome to the Soilcraft Regen Agronomy Podcast. At Soilcraft, our mission is to innovate and lead in the field of regenerative agronomy, forging a path that empowers farmers to produce food that nourishes and heals both the planet and its inhabitants. All right, welcome back to Regen Radio. This week we're switching gears. Well, we're actually not switching gears. We're in the same vein. And look, we promised we'd try to do things weekly, and we are. Craig, where are you joining us from?
Good old Atlanta Airport in the US of A.
Yeah, Craig's away. He's in the USA, and I'll be there shortly. We'll be there passing for about, a month, I think. So week, guys.
Just stay there. Better.
Yeah. This week we are going to, the title of this week's podcast is In Defense of Compost. Last week we got it through compost right under the bus, drove over it, backed over it a few times. And so let's talk about what compost is for. Unfortunately, I think people kind of got upset and thought maybe we don't like compost at all, but I don't think that's true. Do you hate compost?
I hate it as a replacement for nitrogen.
There we go.
I love it for a ton of other things.
Exactly. And that's, to be clear, that's the biggest challenge with compost is often it is people say, well, what do you think? We want to go organic or something. And so we're thinking about using compost for bulk nitrogen applications, of which, man, I knew intuitively it wasn't good, but I had no idea the dumpster fire it was. But compost is great. Why is compost great? We've been composting for thousands of years, mixing greens and browns through an aerobic process, aerating. And basically what we're doing is we're creating an ideal area for beneficial microorganisms to break down waste, which is good because we have waste. We need to take care of waste. And there are a few better ways to turn proverbially garbage or waste into microbial gold. But that being said, I think the argument could be made that your end product is going to be the richest in two things predominantly, which is going to be carbon, your carbonaceous material, and microorganisms. So that being said, we love compost for carbon. If we need to add bulk carbon into a system, stable carbon, clean carbon, if it's done well without weed seeds, etc., and beneficial microorganisms. And depending on what your foodstuffs are and your methods, etc., we can take and we can say compost, but we can direct it a bunch of different ways, right? Because there's not just one type of compost out there.
I think one of the things that was interesting for me was looking at the half-life of different products. So typically we take up half-lives in relation to like uranium or nuclear compounds, but most things have a half-life. And the idea is, how long does it take for half of it to be gone? In very lay terms. And if you actually go in and you look at the half-lives of products, for example, the last week we kind of made it look a little bit like urea was a wonderful thing. Unintentionally, I'd say to some degree. But how long do you think the half-life is for urea, Denver?
Oh my goodness. The half-life for urea. Well, let's assume good conditions, moist conditions.
Average field conditions.
Non-drilled. Average field conditions, the half-life of urea, 72 hours?
2 to 5 days. He's right in the midst. Okay. 72 hours, half-life. You put urea down.
Wow.
You get your nitrogen, 2 to 5 days, okay?
Wow.
Now, take a guess at the half-life of compost. Let's start with, let's say, let's talk about, standard
That'll be 6
compost.
to 12 months, right? 6 to 12 months?
So it's actually significantly higher than that. It's actually into the years,
wow.
Interestingly. So, the upside to that is it sticks around a lot longer. The downside is it's not as available. And obviously that changes. Right. So if you actually look up the half-life of, say, vermicast, Johnson Sioux compost, standard compost, bokashi, Bokashi and standard compost have a much shorter half-life. But your vermicast actually has quite a long half-life, which is pretty interesting. And some of the other things. So I think one of the things we have to think about is okay, when I put down compost for nitrogen, well, that's not so good. And we talked about, if I needed to replace 200 units of nitrogen and what would happen. Well, the reality is if you put down compost, you would never put down 200 units of nitrogen because it's so much longer lasting and it's so much more efficient. So for me, it's an issue of, okay, why do we use it? Well, we use it, one, organic matter. Two, water holding capacity. I mean, one of the big challenges we have in at least here in sub-Saharan Africa is how many crops would we have an economic harvest on if we had one more rain? Well, the reality is if we do the right thing with compost, in some cases we can add the equivalent of one more rain worth of water holding capacity, which then allows us to bridge the gaps between rains and at the end of the season extend it on. And so if you do just a moderate application of compost, you may very well be able to bridge between the spaces. And that's what you see in, say, Foundations for Farming, where they use extensive amount of compost. You see that they experience their crops holding on between the extended windows between rains so much more effectively. Well, is that because they have better nitrogen? Well, not so much. It's a little more efficient, but it's able to be more resilient. And so for resiliency, I think it's a huge thing because it's persistent.
Yeah. And, again, back to the microbial aspect of it, not only is it full of microbes, but it's also full of metabolites and other microbially or microbial stimulants, which increase microbial life in the field. So once you make that application, you're going to increase the cycle rate in your field for your crop residues, increasing your stable carbon and converting crop residue into organic matter or soluble carbon, which again is going to increase that water holding capacity. And just the fact that you have microbes just from the microorganisms that you put out there, whether they're in spore forms and then they rehydrate, animate, or in the case of bacteria, you put bacterium out there and now they have a food source and they're just going to divide and multiply. Those guys in pseudo, like for every cell, there's a cell wall, and inside that cell wall is water. And so just like you're saying, so we can increase, we saw that in trials when we were using our vermicast compost tea. In a potato trial, we saw over 130% increased water holding capacity from the organisms we applied, which, spoiler, my favorite use for compost and vermicast is as an inoculum source for aerobic teas that we can brew and apply through fertigation at scale, because it's just so easy.
Yeah, and I think that's the big takeaway. I mean, one of the big challenges that we talked about with compost, obviously, is the cost, the carbon footprint, the spreading issues. But if you're using it to kind of trigger or mitigate the impacts of loss of organic matter, you can then help to restore some of that equilibrium, that balance to your fields, so they begin to function again. We're seeing people talking about the loss of mycorrhizal fungi in the field, which is one of the first things to be gone in sub-Saharan Africa in traditional cropping methods. You start putting a plow to it, you start putting urea to it, and it's gone. Well, what's the problem? Well, one of the problems is the soil no longer communicates. So, to borrow a biblical term, when the guy on the Tower of Babel orders bricks, he gets straw. And when the guy orders straw, he gets bricks. And he wants a hammer, he gets a screwdriver. The soil breaks down because it stops communicating. You go in there and take a sample of the total unavailable minerals. There's all kinds of them there, but they're not available versus being made available. And so I think using this to help, restore tired or worn out soils is an effective thing, as long as that's not your long-term plan for your main macronutrients.
Yeah, and the other thing to consider is the source, the type of compost. So you've got your aerobic low temp, you've got your bokashis, you've got Johnson Sioux, which is going to be a fungally dominant compost. And then from those, you have what it was comprised of, the foodstuffs. So actually, municipal waste can be a big challenge because you can end up with microplastics and other pollutants and toxins. But it can also be an advantage. And by that, I mean, oftentimes your municipal wastes, especially if the municipalities are good at separating those things out, especially before the composting process. The beauty of it is you're going to get a lot of tree roots and things like that as people are ripping things out. And those tree roots are going to be loaded with mycorrhizal fungi. Whereas if you're getting compost from maybe say a dairy where you're going to be getting bedding, straw, and manure, you're not going to have the mycorrhizal fungi that you will from the municipal waste source. And so obviously the best source would be one that you're controlling, but it's something to note. Look, just like anything, what you see isn't necessarily always what you get. You've got to look back in that and ask, what is it derived from? You also need to do your diligence, even more so, I would say, than synthetic fertilizers, because most of those are pretty standardized, where you really do need to get a sample. You need to have a sample pulled on your compost to find out particularly what your sodium levels are. Again, if you're coming from a feedlot or a dairy site, a lot of manure, you can have a lot of sodium in there, a lot of potassium. Whereas if you're getting composted chicken, well, then you can get composted chicken from broilers, which can have more calcium from the eggshells. So anyways, it's not just, compost isn't just compost. It can be exceptional, and it can also become problematic.
I think, maybe just to give a window in after last week's beating of compost, I use compost every year in my field to grow wheat. You say, well, how do you do that? Well, I don't bulk spread it, but I do use Johnson Sioux compost to inoculate all my seed. And so I'm getting basically a gridding re-inoculation of the field with that mycorrhizal fungi and that very carbon dominant compost, and that helps to keep the field fully active and fully fresh of the beneficial forms of life that are there. And so we use that vermicast tea. We're using a compost or vermicast compost tea throughout the year in the fields through foliars and fertigations. And we use things like IMOs and some of these other very, very potent composts for special applications. So we use it throughout it. And I'd say that the thing that I've noticed is if we do the math, compost is very expensive. But if you use it in the correct way, you can stimulate basically sheet composting in your entire fields. And that's what we're experiencing now. Is I could never afford to buy the compost to do what's happening in my field now, because we used compost and compost extracts in a special way to prime and develop the soil. So now I'm getting benefits of millions of dollars worth of vermicast or other compost methods happening right on the top of my field, because we used the other things to get life and the network communicating again in the soil.
Yeah, 100%, exactly. And that's just it. We just have to know, what is the greatest benefit from whichever input. Again, like you said last week, someone might have got the idea that we were urea fanboys. And the truth is just, it has its place. It has its positive. Yeah. Its positive is its negative. Its positive is that it's available now, and it's highly potent. That is the downside. They say dilution is the solution of pollution. And with urea, that can really be true. Any of those synthetic fertilizers. And so they're really on opposite ends of the spectrum, both great tools to utilize, but, in the right place at the right time, et cetera. And, depending on the crop too, because, we're talking about spreading, we're talking about wheat, but also when we get into tree crops or the bananas, for instance, in the nursery setting, compost plays a huge role when we get into nursery setting, where we can utilize, look, we want to have carbon there for water holding capacity and to help, because, we want to mix sand or some grit in there so that we have drainage in our pots, but we also need something to hold it there, but we need something that won't cause disease. Well, a good compost is idyllic for that. Or again, maybe you've got a fledgling nursery and you're going into your soil, and your soil's hard as a brick and low on organic matter. Well, then you can actually you won't spend a lot of money per hectare or per acre, but you can put a high amount of compost under the drip line of your trees, for instance, and really increase that zone. Or maybe you've got a dripper, an emitter for your sprinkler. You can put a high amount of compost right around that dripper emitter, which is going to act to protect the surface of the soil, hold water, create an ideal climate, and inoculate your soil.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the big things is, like you say, how you use it. One of the things I would argue for is, we looked at the model last week and it was, apocalyptic, cut everything down, make it all into compost and the world ends. The flip side is how much of the material on your farm are you burning or leaving someplace in the least growable space on your farm to get it out of the way. And then you find out the best soil in your farm is a place you can't use it. So one of the challenges that I have and that I'm working towards is, basically a zero burn, a zero waste policy on the farm, where if there's anything that's tree trimmings, anything that's plant-based, let's get it into a compost pile or into a Johnson-Su reactor or into something of that nature. Or if you're going to burn it, into a biochar facility so that you're capturing that carbon long-term and you're using it instead of throwing it away. So it may not be sustainable to use it as a nitrogen replacement, but it is sustainable to throw away nutrients that you have for free so that you can then buy something that you have to pay money for. And so I think those are things we can use to be wise stewards of what God's given us.
Yeah, that's right. That's a great point. And I might also add to that as a dovetail, exactly what you're saying. If we can utilize different aspects of our farm so that we can do everything we can to increase the proximity, or rather reduce the distance that compost has to travel. Because really, when you get to looking at the numbers, the two things that makes compost such a potential CO2 emitter is going to be your transport from a long ways away and your spreading. So if we reduce or eliminate the transport, so we're doing it on farm or very close, and if we reduce the amount that we're applying, or we put it on through a tea or an inoculant, seed inoculant, like you're saying, now we've eliminated those two things, and now all of a sudden, it doesn't look so bad. But once again, we're not using it as a primary nitrogen source, and that's what we're doing. We're trying to utilize urea and balancing it out with our liquid carbon sources, with our soil vigor, to offset that and reduce the amount we're putting on at any given time. So we're taking advantage of that urea for its nitrogen, but then we're utilizing liquid carbon sources and we're utilizing compost for what its strength is, and reducing, obviously, all that CO2 emission from transport and application.
I know we're getting to the edge of along, but I would just say one of the big things I think we have to be aware of is the attempt to either vilify or greenwash things. You can end the world through making compost. You could, theoretically. You can also end the world through, the misuse of synthetics. We've been working at that for a long time, probably the last 70 years. We've been trying that experiment. And so I think what we're advocating here is a holistic thing that says, use things for where their strength is. If urea's strength is in the nitrogen, package it with the things that have strength, the the biochars, the liquid carbon pathway, basically mimicking the liquid carbon pathway exudate of plants. Let's package it together. And when we do, we find amazing things. We find that we get what we couldn't afford to buy in either the synthetic or the biological space happening under our feet in the field.
Yeah, well said. Sounds good. Okay, we're going to wrap this up and put a bow on it. And thanks for joining us on Regen Radio this week. We'll see you next week, and join us to see what we get up to. Thanks very much. Thanks, Craig. We'll see you soon. Go make some compost. All right. Thanks so much for joining us as we expand our paradigms and explore what's possible in the realm of regen agronomy. If you would like to contact us or learn more about what we do, please visit our website at www.soilcraft.com, as well as our YouTube channel. If you have topics you would like us to unpack or stories, please connect with us so that we can share them with others.